My ex dumped me for my skinny best friend because I was too fat. But on his wedding day, his own mother called me, begging me to come see something I would never forget. I was standing barefoot in my kitchen, still wearing an old college sweatshirt, when the phone rang. 10:17 in the morning, Grant's wedding day. My plan was simple. Stay home, watch something forgettable, feel nothing at all. I almost let it ring out. The voice on the other end was shaking. Eleanor, Grant's mother. She hadn't called me once in the 8 months since I packed my boxes and walked out of his apartment on Larkspur Lane. Wren, her breath hot on my name. Come to Ridgemont Country Club right now. Don't change. Don't think. Just come. You do not want to miss this. I should have hung up. I should have finished my coffee and let whatever was happening happen without me. Instead, I grabbed my keys off the counter and left the mug half full in the sink. The drive took 11 minutes. I counted every one of them, hands tight on the wheel, my heart doing something I didn't have a name for yet. The parking lot looked like the aftermath of something. Guests in formal wear stood frozen in tight little clusters near the entrance, phones out, nobody talking above a whisper. A woman in champagne silk sobbed into her cell by the fountain, mascara tracked down to her jaw. The valets weren't moving cars. They were just watching. Inside, past the wide double doors, an enormous floral centerpiece lay shattered across the ballroom floor. White peonies and ranunculus soaked into cream carpet, gone dark with spilled champagne. A crystal flute lay in pieces near the window. Nobody had swept it up. Nobody seemed to know whose job that was anymore. Somewhere near the head table, a string quartet sat with instruments still in hand, nobody having told them yet whether to keep playing or pack up and go home. A seating chart on an easel had been knocked sideways, half its little printed name cards scattered across the floor near my feet. I stood in the doorway of a wedding that was clearly not happening, wearing sweatpants, 8 months removed from ever expecting to set foot in this building again. Eleanor found me first. Her pearls were perfect. Everything else about her was falling apart. Wren, she grabbed both my hands. Thank God you came. I looked past her at the wreckage at 140 guests with nowhere left to go. Eleanor, I said, what happened? She didn't answer right away. She just looked at me, really looked, the way you look at someone you're about to ask an enormous favor of. Come with me first, she said. There's something you need to see. I want to tell you what she showed me. I will, but it won't make sense yet. So first you need to understand how I ended up standing in that ballroom at all, because none of it works without the 12 years that came before it. I met Bryn Castellano when I was 19, fall of my sophomore year at Ohio State, a dorm hallway in Siebert, a knock at my door at 11 at night because she'd locked herself out of her room and needed to borrow a phone charger. She had a laugh that filled a hallway. I had a mini fridge stocked with off-brand soda. That was the whole foundation. It turned out to be enough for 12 years. We were an unlikely pair from the start, and everyone said so, usually with a little laugh attached, like it needed explaining. Bryn was 5'9", effortlessly thin, the kind of woman who ordered dessert and never finished it and never seemed to think about it twice. I was 5'4" and built differently, and by the time we graduated, I'd spent a decade hearing variations of the same sentence. You have such a pretty face. I used to think that sentence was a compliment. It took me years to hear the rest of it, the part nobody said out loud. I met Grant Hollis through Bryn at a bar called The Junction near campus, the spring before graduation. He was a junior in the architecture program, tall, quiet in a way that read as thoughtful until you knew him better. He asked for my number, not Bryn's, and for a long time that felt like the most surprising thing that had ever happened to me. We started dating in April of 2014. I was 22. For a long time it was good, genuinely good. Grant graduated, took a job at a firm called Bennett & Cole in Ridgemont, and I finished my degree in health sciences a year behind him. We moved in together in 2018, an apartment at 214 Larkspur Lane, Unit 4B, 2 bedrooms and a leaky kitchen faucet, and a view of a parking structure we used to joke was our city skyline. Bryn stayed close through all of it. She was in that apartment more than some of my own family. She helped me pick the paint color for the bedroom, a soft gray called Cloud 9 that took 4 coats to look right. She was there the night Grant and I signed the lease, popping a bottle of $10 Prosecco on our unfinished kitchen floor because we hadn't bought furniture yet. There was an earlier moment, though, one I didn't understand the weight of until much later. February of 2022, Grant's 30th birthday. A private room at a restaurant called Vale and Vine. 20 of us at a long table, and at some point during the toasts, Grant's uncle raised a glass and said something about how lucky Grant was to have found someone so easygoing. Grant laughed and said, "Wren's the low-maintenance one. She doesn't need a whole production. She just goes along with whatever." Everyone laughed. I laughed too, because I thought it was a compliment. Because for years I had built an entire identity around being the woman who didn't need anything, who never made things difficult, who absorbed whatever was handed to her without complaint. I didn't hear the other version of that sentence until I was standing in my own kitchen 8 months before that wedding, and Grant said almost the same words in a completely different tone. There was another moment, smaller, easier to miss. Fall of 2021, a bridal boutique 2 towns over, helping a mutual friend named Priya try on dresses for her own wedding. Bryn held up a fitted mermaid silhouette against my body in the mirror and said, not unkindly, "You'd look incredible in this if you dropped a size, honestly." She said it like she was handing me a gift. I said thanks. I didn't think about it again until much later, when I understood that the people closest to you sometimes tell you exactly what they think of you, disguised as encouragement, years before they ever act on it. There was a trip, too, that I think about more than almost anything else from those years. September of 2019, a long weekend in Asheville to celebrate my 27th birthday. birthday. A rented cabin with a hot tub on the deck and a view of the Blue Ridge Mountains that looked unreal in the morning fog. Grant planned the whole thing himself, which felt significant at the time since he wasn't usually the planning type. We hiked 8 miles the first day, ate barbecue on a porch overlooking the French Broad River, and on the second night he brought out a small cake from a bakery in town. 1 candle, no fanfare. I remember thinking, this is what the rest of my life is supposed to look like. On the drive home, somewhere around Knoxville, he mentioned almost offhandedly that his coworker Diane had just started a program that dropped her a dress size in 6 weeks. And didn't I think that sounded like something worth trying sometime? I said maybe. I spent the rest of the drive quiet, watching the mountains flatten out into interstate, feeling the whole weekend recolor itself in my memory. Even the good years, I've come to understand, had a current running underneath them. I just didn't know how to read it yet. There was a fight too, one of the only real ones we had in the spring of 2020, when my mother was hospitalized for 3 days with a heart arrhythmia, and I asked Grant to come with me to visit her in Columbus, 2 hours away. He said he had a deadline at the firm. I went alone, sat in a vinyl chair beside my mother's bed for 3 straight nights, and when I got home, exhausted, Grant asked why I looked like that, like the question itself was an inconvenience. Like what? I said. Tired, he said. You should sleep more. It shows on your face. I didn't have the energy to explain that grief and fear look different on a person than laziness does. I went to bed instead. We didn't discuss it again. I filed it away with everything else. By the time I was 30, I weighed around 210 pounds on a 5'4" frame. I want to say that plainly, because the story that follows only works if you understand I am not describing a small, invisible discomfort. I had spent years hearing in 100 small ways that my body was a problem to be managed. Grant never said it outright. Grant didn't have to. He said it in the restaurants he picked, always ones with small portions and clean plating. He said it in the way he'd glance at what I ordered before ordering something lighter himself, like he was setting an example I hadn't asked for. He said it in 7 years of birthday and Christmas gifts that were, without fail, gym memberships, or workout clothes, or once, a bathroom scale wrapped in ribbon that I never opened. I told myself he meant well. I told myself that for a very long time. I should say something about Bryn during those same years, because her presence in the relationship was never neutral either, even when it looked like simple friendship. She was the one who suggested more than once that the 3 of us do a juice cleanse together before a beach trip, framing it as a fun group activity, something bonding, and getting quietly frustrated when I'd decline. She was the one who, at my own 29th birthday dinner, ordered a slice of cake for the table to share, and then ate exactly 2 bites of it before pushing her plate toward me, saying, "Go ahead, I'm so full," in a voice pitched just loud enough for the table to hear. Small things, individually forgettable. I only see the pattern now, looking backward, the way you only see a staircase clearly once you've already fallen down it. 6 years. That's how long Grant and I were together when it ended. Not married. We'd talked about it vaguely, the way people do when they think they have time. I thought we had time. It ended on a Thursday, November 14th, 2024. I came home early from my job at a physical therapy clinic on Denby Street, a headache and a canceled afternoon appointment sending me back to Larkspur Lane 3 hours ahead of schedule. I climbed the stairs already thinking about takeout, about a hot shower, about nothing at all. I opened the door to my own bedroom and found Grant and Bryn in my bed, my own throw pillow tucked behind her head like she'd bought the apartment herself. Grant didn't even flinch. That's the detail I keep coming back to, all these months later. He didn't jump, didn't scramble for a blanket, didn't do any of the things you'd expect from a man caught in the worst possible moment of his life. He just looked at me, almost bored, like I was the one interrupting something. Bryn scrambled. She grabbed the sheet, said my name twice, said Ren, oh my god, Ren, like a woman testing whether the sound of it would fix anything. I didn't answer her. I stood in the doorway of my own bedroom for what felt like a very long time, and was probably 11 seconds. And then I turned around and walked back to the kitchen and started making myself a cup of tea, because my hands needed something to do that wasn't shaking. Bryn left 20 minutes later, fully dressed, not looking at me on her way out. She said quietly, "We should talk when you're ready." I didn't respond. The door clicked shut behind her, and then it was just Grant and me and a kettle starting to whistle on the stove. He sat me down in the living room an hour later, after the tea had gone cold in my hands, and delivered what I can only describe as a prepared statement. Calm, measured, like a lawyer reading a memo he'd written in advance, maybe even one he'd been drafting in his head for weeks. "I need you to understand, this isn't really about Bryn," he started. "It's been building for a while. I think you know that." "I didn't know that," I said. "I didn't know any of that." "Come on, Ren." He said it gently, which somehow made it worse. "You've let yourself go. You don't match my life anymore." I asked him what that meant, exactly, because I genuinely wanted to hear him say it out loud, wanted to make him spend the words instead of letting the sentence float there doing its damage in the abstract. "You used to care about things," he said, "about how you looked, about us, about what we were building. Somewhere in the last couple years, you just stopped. I've been carrying this relationship by myself for a long time, and I'm tired." He said it like a man describing a weather pattern, something that had simply happened to him rather than something he'd decided. I didn't cry in front of him. I want that on the record, too. I sat very still and let him finish, and when he was done, I stood up and went to the bedroom and started pulling clothes off hangers. Match. I would hear that word again, 8 months later, in a hallway mirror at Ridgemont Country Club, and it would land just as hard the second time. Bryn never apologized apologized either. Not really. She texted me 2 days later. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. Not sorry she did it. Sorry I found out. I read that message maybe 30 times before I understood what it actually was. It wasn't remorse. It was damage control. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I packed one bag that night and walked out of that apartment with my head high and my hands shaking the entire drive to my sister's guest room, where I slept for 6 weeks before I could afford a place of my own. My sister Alyssa is 4 years older than me and has never once in her life let me get away with a lie, including the ones I tell myself. The first night, she didn't ask what happened beyond the basics. She just made up the pull-out couch, put a glass of water on the side table, and sat with me until I fell asleep, the way she used to when we were kids, and I'd had a nightmare. It was the second week, over coffee at her kitchen table, when she finally said the thing I needed someone to say out loud. You know, none of this is because of your body, right? People who actually love you don't leave because a number on a scale went up. They leave because they were already looking for a door, and your body just gave them an excuse that felt more comfortable to say out loud than the truth. I didn't believe her yet. It took months before I did. But I remember exactly where I was sitting when she said it, and I've come back to that sentence more times than I could count. What came after was its own education. Slow, in pieces, but unmistakable once I started paying attention. The first piece arrived 2 weeks after I moved out, in a text from Grant about the security deposit on Larkspur Lane. We'd split it down the middle when we signed the lease in 2018, $1,200 each, $2,400 total. The landlord returned it in full when Grant renewed under his own name that December. Since technically nothing in the unit was damaged, Grant kept it, all of it. When I asked about my half, he told me he'd already put it toward the emotional cost of the situation, a phrase he must have practiced, because it came out smooth and rehearsed, like he'd rehearsed the other line too. I called him about it once, the only phone call we had in that entire first month. That's my money, Grant. It has nothing to do with the emotional cost of anything. You left, he said. You made this decision. I don't think it's unreasonable for me to be compensated for the disruption. I remember standing in my sister's guest bedroom, phone pressed to my ear, laughing in a way that had no humor in it at all. You cheated on me in our bed. I didn't make a decision. I reacted to one you already made. We can agree to disagree on the sequence of events, he said. And that was the sentence that told me everything I needed to know about how the rest of this would go. Sequence of events. Like we were negotiating a contract dispute instead of talking about the end of 6 years. I let it go. $1,200 felt like a small price for never having to negotiate anything with him again. I told myself that. I mostly believed it. The second piece came through other people, the way these things always do. Priya, the same friend whose boutique trip I mentioned, called me in December to check in, and somewhere in that call she mentioned, carefully, that Grant had been telling people a version of events where I'd changed over the last couple years, where I'd stopped taking care of myself, where the breakup was sad but understandable, really, once you knew the full picture. Nobody at that dinner table with his uncle's toast would have called me low maintenance if they'd heard this new version. I asked Priya if she believed it. She was quiet for a second too long before she said, "Of course not," and that pause told me more than her answer did. I didn't call Grant to argue. I didn't post anything, didn't correct the record with anyone who hadn't asked me directly. I went to therapy instead, a woman named Dr. Elaine Sorby, who had a corner office above a dry cleaner on Fenmore Avenue, and in our second session, she asked me one question I've thought about nearly every day since. When did you start deciding your own needs were negotiable? I didn't have an answer. I went back the next week still working on one. The narrative kept spreading in ways I only half witnessed. There was a group chat, 9 of us, formed years earlier for planning a friend's bachelorette party, and never disbanded. The kind of low-traffic thread that mostly existed for birthday reminders and the occasional meme. In January, without any announcement, I noticed I could no longer see new messages. I texted one of the members, a woman named Holly, to ask if the group had moved somewhere else. She took almost a full day to respond, and when she did, her answer was careful in a way that told me she'd thought about how to phrase it. Grant asked if it would be weird if he stayed in it and you didn't, since he and Bryn were together now and it might be uncomfortable for everyone. Nobody really wanted to be the one to say no. I wasn't angry at Holly. I understood the physics of it. It's always easier to remove the person who won't make a scene about being removed. I went back to Dr. Sorby's office that week and told her about the group chat, expecting her to say something about boundaries or self-worth. Instead, she asked whether I'd noticed a pattern in who kept getting asked to make room and who never had to. I sat with that question longer than I sat with most of the others. There was another session in early spring when I told her about the gym membership Grant had given me for Christmas 3 years running and how I'd finally, that February, signed up for a membership of my own choosing, at a different gym entirely, paid for with my own money. I expected her to praise the decision. Instead, she asked me to describe how it felt walking through the door the first time. I told her it felt like trespassing, like I was somewhere I hadn't been given permission to be. That's worth sitting with, she said. A decision that's entirely your own, still feeling like trespassing, tells you something about how long you'd been asking permission for things that were never anyone else's to grant. I wrote that down on my phone in the parking lot afterward. The way I'd started doing with most of what she said, building a small private archive of sentences I wasn't ready to fully believe yet, but wasn't willing to lose either. The third piece was Bryn, and it was the one that hurt the most, because Bryn never fully let go. Through January and February, she sent texts every couple of weeks, always late at night, always some version of the same message. I miss you so much. I know I don't deserve to say that. Grant and I aren't even that serious. Don't let this ruin ruin us. One night in late January, she called instead of texting, twice in a row, and I almost didn't pick up the second time. When I did, she was crying, or performing crying. I genuinely couldn't tell which anymore. I don't know how to exist without you in my life, she said. You're the only person who's ever really known me. You knew exactly what you were doing when you got in that bed, I said. You don't get to lose the parts of me you're comfortable losing and keep the parts you miss. That's not fair. None of this has been fair, Bryn. I'm not sure why I'm the one who's supposed to fix that for you. I hung up before she could answer. She called back 4 more times that night. I didn't pick up any of them. I didn't respond to most of the texts that followed. The one time I did, in February, I wrote back, "You had 12 years of friendship, and you decided a few months with him was worth more. I'm not interested in staying close to someone who thought that math worked out." She didn't text again for 3 weeks. Then she sent one more. "I hope you know I still love you, and I do think you're better off." That last part, better off, sat in my phone for a long time. It sounded like an apology. It wasn't. It was permission she was giving herself. The fourth piece was smaller, almost invisible at the time. In March, at a baby shower for a college friend, one where I hadn't known Bryn would attend either, I overheard her talking to 2 other women near the drink table. She was laughing about a spin class, describing her trainer at a boutique gym called Ember Fitness as the only person who actually got her. She said his name once, Milo. She said he understood her in a way nobody else did. Said it in that breathless way people talk when they think no one important is listening. I didn't think much of it at the time. I filed it away the way you file away 100 small details about people you're trying to stop thinking about. I didn't know yet that I'd need it. The 5th piece was Eleanor, and it came in April, 7 months before the wedding, at a mutual friend's engagement party I almost didn't attend. I'd lost 40 pounds by then, working with a trainer named Marcus Webb, who didn't ask questions, just handed me a plan and expected me to follow it. Eleanor found me by the drink table and looked me over slowly, head to toe, the way you'd study a used car you were thinking of buying. "Look at you," she said. "You look wonderful. Grant always said you had it in you." I said thank you, because I hadn't yet learned how to say what I actually felt in that moment, which was that a woman was congratulating me for finally becoming acceptable, 7 months after her son left me for not being acceptable enough. I drove home from that party and cried for the first time in weeks, not because I was sad about Grant, but because I understood, fully, for the first time, that his entire family had absorbed his version of events without question. I had been recast, quietly, as a project that finally succeeded. There was a 6th piece before the 6th piece, if that makes sense. A smaller humiliation that arrived in May, close enough to the wedding that I think it was meant to soften me up for the ask that followed. Grant's cousin was getting married that same month, a wedding I'd have attended without a second thought 2 years earlier, and I found out about it only because Priya mentioned it in passing, assuming I already knew. I hadn't been invited. When I asked her carefully whether that was intentional, she said she'd heard through someone in the family that Grant had asked the cousin to leave me off the list, framing it as a kindness. It would just be easier for everyone if things stayed simple. I sat with that phrase for a long time. Easier for everyone. Easier specifically for Grant, who got to keep attending every family event uninterrupted, while I quietly vanished from a decade of gatherings, one guest list at a time. I didn't fight it. I sent the cousin a short, warm text wishing her well, meant every word of it, and spent that Saturday at a 5K with Marcus instead, finishing in just under 40 minutes, a personal best at the time. It felt like a strange kind of trade. I lost a wedding invitation. I gained a morning that belonged entirely to me. The 6th piece proper came in June, 5 weeks before the wedding, when Grant called me directly for the first time since the breakup. My phone lit up with his name, and I let it ring 3 full times before I answered, mostly out of disbelief that he'd actually done it. "I need a favor," he said, no greeting first. "The country club's events coordinator quit mid-planning. Bryn's overwhelmed with the vendor stuff, and I remembered you helped plan Priya's cousin's wedding at the same venue a few years back. You still have the florist's contact, right? The one who did the arch?" I stood in my kitchen holding the phone away from my face for a second, checking that this was really happening. "You're asking me to help plan your wedding to Bryn." "I'm asking for a phone number," he said, like I was the one being unreasonable. "It's not a big thing. It's an enormous thing, Grant. I thought we were past being weird about this." His voice had an edge of impatience now, the tone of a man who felt he was being made to work too hard for something small. "I figured you'd want things to go smoothly for everyone. You're not that person, are you?" The bitter ex? There it was. The reframe, right on schedule. Refusing to help plan my ex-boyfriend's wedding to my former best friend recast as some character flaw I needed to rise above. "No," I said, once, clearly. "And Grant, don't call me again unless it's an emergency." Then I hung up the phone. That was the last time I spoke to Grant Hollis before his wedding day. I want to say I felt triumphant when I hung up that phone. Mostly I just felt tired. Tired of being the reasonable one in every exchange. Tired of absorbing each new insult like it was mine to carry. Tired of watching 2 people rewrite 12 years and 6 years into a story where I was simply an obstacle they'd both, separately, outgrown. I didn't think about Milo again until the morning of July 11th, standing in a ruined ballroom watching Eleanor's hands shake as she led me toward a private lounge in the back. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. The lounge was small, meant for wedding parties to gather before ceremonies, all soft soft lighting and a long mirror and a rack of garment bags nobody had touched. Eleanor closed the door behind us and handed me her phone without a word. It took me a second to understand what I was looking at. A thread of messages, dozens of them, some going back months. Bryn's name at the top. Screenshots someone had pulled from her phone that morning, apparently while helping her into her dress, when a text notification lit up the screen at the worst possible second. Miss you already. Can't stop thinking about last night. The messages weren't from Grant. His name is Milo Reyes, Eleanor said. Her voice had gone flat, the way voices do when a person has already cried past the point of tears. He's a trainer at some gym she goes to. It's been going on since at least March, maybe longer. There are hotel receipts. There's a whole conversation about him leaving his wife for her, and her telling him to wait until after the wedding so it wouldn't look bad. March. I felt something click into place, cold and precise. The baby shower rising up in my memory with a clarity it hadn't had in months. The only person who actually gets her. I had heard the first sentence of this story 4 months before anyone else did, standing near a drink table, and hadn't known it yet for what it was. I scrolled further, and Eleanor let me, her arms crossed tight over the champagne silk of her mother of the groom dress. The messages went back further than March, actually. Late February. A first exchange that started innocuously. Bryn thanking him for a modified workout plan. Him responding with something slightly too warm for a client-trainer relationship. By April, it had turned into something else entirely. There was a message from Bryn, dated the same week as the engagement party, where Eleanor had told me I looked wonderful. I know I'm getting married in 3 months, and none of this makes sense, but I don't feel like myself with anyone except you. There was a hotel confirmation from a Marriott 2 towns over, dated in May. The same week Bryn had told the bridal party she was in Chicago for a work conference. There was a message from just 4 days ago. Milo telling her he couldn't keep doing this, that he needed her to actually choose, and Bryn responding, I will. After the wedding, I promise. I just don't want to lose the venue deposit. I set the phone down on the vanity between us, my hands unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with grief. She was going to marry him anyway, I said, knowing all of this. She was going to marry him and keep Milo on the side, Eleanor said, until Milo's wife apparently got tired of waiting to find out which one of them was the side. She pressed a hand to her mouth for a second, composing herself. I keep asking myself how I didn't see it. I was so focused on you, on whether you'd finally accept that Grant had made the right choice, that I never once looked closely at the choice he actually made. It was the closest thing to an admission I would ever hear from her, and even then, it took a canceled wedding to pull it out of her. His wife showed up, Eleanor continued, about an hour ago. A woman named Sasha, apparently. She'd found the messages herself, tracked his location straight to the bridal suite, and walked in on the two of them saying goodbye before the ceremony. Eleanor pressed her fingers to her temple, as though the retelling itself was giving her a headache. One of the bridesmaids told me most of it. Apparently, Sasha didn't even raise her voice at first, just stood in the doorway in a raincoat, holding her phone up with the messages already open, and asked Bryn, calm as anything, whether the dress cost more than her marriage did. Bryn's mother tried to physically block the door, kept saying this was a private moment, and Sasha just laughed and said something about how private the last 4 months had apparently been too. Someone knocked over the flower arrangement trying to get between them. That's the centerpiece you saw in the ballroom. Milo just stood there, apparently. Didn't say a single word the entire time. Sasha left after about 10 minutes, but not before telling half the wedding party exactly what her husband had been doing for the last 4 months, in detail, with dates, loud enough that the sound carried straight through the wall into the ballroom where the string quartet was still tuning up, completely unaware anything had gone wrong. I tried to picture it, 140 people arranging themselves into rows of white chairs, a quartet running through scales, all of it unfolding 20 feet from a woman reciting her husband's affair like a court transcript. No wonder the champagne flute had ended up in pieces near the window. No wonder nobody had known whose job it was to sweep up anything. Where's Bryn now? I asked. Gone. She left in the dress, a $6,000 dress, and she just walked out to her car in it and drove off, and nobody has heard from her since. Eleanor's mouth twisted. She told her bridesmaids weeks ago apparently that Grant was boring. That's the word one of them used when she finally told me just now. Boring. She called my son a placeholder while she waited to see if this other man would actually leave his wife for her. I stood there holding a stranger's phone, looking at proof of an affair that had been unfolding in plain sight for 4 months, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel at all. Not joy exactly. Something closer to a door swinging open in a room I'd assumed was sealed shut. 12 years of friendship, and Bryn had spent the last several months of it doing to Grant almost exactly what Grant and Bryn had done to me, except somehow worse, because she'd known the whole time she might not even go through with it. She'd let 140 people fly and drive in, let a florist deliver $6,000 of peonies, let her own mother sew last-minute alterations into a dress, all while quietly keeping her exits open. Eleanor watched my face, waiting for something. I know this is a lot, she said, but I need you to understand what I'm about to ask you. Eleanor, everyone's already here. Her hands found mine again, tighter this time. The flowers are paid for. The officiant is standing right outside, and he told me he can do a simple civil ceremony if we ask him to. Grant is devastated, Wren, but he's here, and you're here, and everyone in that ballroom already knows the two of you have history. We could still do something small today. Nobody would think it was strange. I actually laughed. It came out before I could stop it, sharp and surprised. You called me here, I said slowly, to marry your son, at his own canceled wedding. 6 hours after his fiancée fiancé ran off in the dress. Don't let your pride ruin. He sat me down 8 months ago, I said, in our old living room, and told me I didn't match his life anymore. Those were his exact words, not mine. Today is just everyone else finally catching up to what he already knew. We walked back out into the ballroom together, and I want to tell you that the whole room went quiet and turned to watch, the way it does in movies, but it wasn't like that. It was smaller and stranger than that. A dozen people were close enough to hear the tail end of it, close enough to see Eleanor grab for my hands one more time near the shattered centerpiece. We could still do something small today, she said, loud enough now that I saw two heads turn near the bar. A quiet civil ceremony. Everyone's already here. The flowers are paid for. The officiant is flexible, he told me himself. He can do something simple in 20 minutes if we ask him to. I almost laughed out loud. You called me here, I said slowly, to marry your son, at his own canceled wedding, 6 hours after his fiancée ran off in the dress. Don't let your pride ruin. He sat me down 8 months ago, I said, in our old living room, and told me I didn't match his life anymore. Those were his exact words, not mine. Today is just everyone else finally catching up to what he already knew. Walter Hollis was close enough to hear all of it. He was standing near the bar with his jacket off, tie loosened, a glass of something amber untouched in his hand, watching his wife beg his son's ex-girlfriend to marry his son within the same hour his son's fiancée had fled the building. I saw something move across his face that looked a great deal like shame, and then, quietly, he set the glass down and walked over. Eleanor, he said, and his voice carried the particular calm of a man who rarely raised it and didn't need to. That's enough. Let her go. Eleanor turned on him, something desperate flashing across her face. Walter, I am trying to salvage what's left of today. There's nothing left of today to salvage, he said. There hasn't been since about 11 o'clock this morning. Let the woman go home. He looked at me then, and his voice softened into something almost apologetic. I'm sorry you got dragged into this, Wren. You didn't deserve any of it, then or now. It was the first time in 8 months anyone in that family had said something to me without an agenda folded inside it. I didn't know what to do with it in the moment, so I just nodded and said thank you, and turned to leave. Grant's younger sister, Callie, was another one close enough to have heard the whole exchange. She didn't say anything either, just watched her mother with an expression I recognized, because I'd worn it myself for years around these same people. Recognition, arriving too late to be useful, but arriving all the same. I turned and walked out past the broken flowers, past 140 guests with nowhere left to go, and I did not look back once. I drove home shaking so hard I pulled over twice. By the time I reached my apartment, I made tea, sat down at my kitchen table, and finally remembered how to breathe like a normal person again. Then, at 7:45 that night, 3 sharp knocks hit my front door. I already knew who it was before I opened it. Through the peephole, I could see Grant, and behind him, a step back, his sister Callie, arms crossed, clearly along for the ride, but wanting no part of whatever came next. I opened the door. Grant stood there in a wrinkled dress shirt, tie gone completely, eyes red and hollowed out like he hadn't slept in a year, even though it had only been one very long day. He looked at me the way you look at something you thought you fully understood, and suddenly do not. Wren, he said, just my name. Nothing else came out. I waited. His mouth opened again. Whatever he had rehearsed on the drive over was gone completely. He just stood there like the ground had shifted and he couldn't find where to put his feet. Then he said the thing I never expected to hear. There's something about tonight you still don't know. I crossed my arms. Then tell me. He looked back at Callie once, like he was hoping she'd stop him. She didn't. She just stared at him, waiting the same as I was. When I found out about Milo this morning, Grant said, before Sasha even showed up, before any of it, I wasn't as blindsided as everyone thinks. I'd been talking to someone else too, a woman at the firm. Nothing physical, I swear, but texting mostly for about a month. I'd been trying to figure out how to call things off with Bryn without being the guy who left twice. And then this morning happened and it just solved the problem for me. I didn't have to be the villain. She did it first. His voice cracked. I know how that sounds. It sounds, I said, exactly like what happened to me 8 months ago, except worse, because you're describing it like a scheduling conflict that resolved itself. I'm not proud of it. I don't think you're capable of being proud or ashamed of anything that involves another person's feelings, Grant. I think you just move to whichever option requires the least from you. I looked past him at Callie, who hadn't moved, who had gone very still, absorbing every word. You didn't come here because you're sorry. You came here because I'm the only person left who used to make you feel like you were the reasonable one. I'm not going to do that for you anymore. That's not fair. I came here because I owed you the truth. You owed me the truth 8 months ago in our own living room instead of a line about matching your life. This isn't honesty, Grant. This is you needing somewhere to put it down so it stops being heavy. I kept my voice level. It surprised me how level it stayed. You've done this twice now. Found the exit before you had to be the one holding the door. I don't think that's a coincidence you get to write off as bad luck. Behind him, Callie made a small sound, something between a breath and a laugh with no humor in it. Grant, she said quietly, is that true? The thing with the woman at your firm? He didn't answer her. That more than anything he'd said to me seemed to answer it for her. Wren, you told me I didn't match your life, I said. You were right. I don't. I never will again. And that's the best thing that's happened to me in 8 months. I closed the door, gently. No slamming, no last word screamed down the hallway. Just a door closing, and on the other side, silence, and then footsteps. Callie's, not Grant's, walking away first. I heard her voice, muffled through the wood, saying something something short and sharp to her brother in the stairwell. I didn't catch the words. I didn't need to. The days after the wedding that wasn't spread outward the way spilled water does, finding every low place in the floor. Eleanor called me twice more that week. I didn't answer either time. She left one voicemail, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, saying she was sorry, that she'd been so afraid of losing her son's happiness that she'd stopped noticing when he stopped deserving it. I saved the voicemail. I didn't call back yet. Some apologies need time to prove they're not just another performance. Walter Hollis reached out differently, through a handwritten note left with the doorman at my building, since he didn't have my new address. It said simply that he was sorry for what his family had allowed to happen to me, that he should have said something at that 30th birthday dinner 3 years ago and hadn't, and that he hoped I knew the silence hadn't meant agreement. I read that note more times than I read Eleanor's voicemail transcript. Callie was the real surprise. She texted me the next morning, no preamble. Can we get coffee? I need to talk to someone who isn't insane right now. We met at a place called Fenmore Coffee near my new apartment, and she told me things I hadn't known. That she'd watched her mother reshape the family's memory of the breakup in real time over the last 8 months. Watched Grant get folded into the role of victim, while I quietly disappeared from every group chat and holiday invitation. I used to think staying neutral was the responsible thing, she told me, turning her cup slowly on the table without drinking from it. Like if I didn't take a side, I wasn't contributing to the problem. But watching my mom beg you to marry my brother yesterday, in front of an entire ballroom, 6 hours after his fiancée left in the dress, I don't think neutral was ever a real option. I think I was just choosing the side that was easier to live with and calling it fairness. She said she'd let it happen because objecting felt exhausting and pointless, that pushing back against her mother had never once changed her mother's mind about anything in 26 years, so she'd stopped trying somewhere along the way and told herself that was wisdom instead of what it actually was. She apologized for that plainly, without asking me to reassure her or tell her it was fine. It was the only apology in the whole aftermath that didn't come with a hidden request attached. Grant showed up at my work once in early August, which I hadn't expected and should have. I was leading a Tuesday evening session at Marcus's gym, walking a client named Denise through a set of goblet squats, when I looked up and saw him standing near the front desk in his work clothes, clearly having come straight from the firm. I finished Denise's set before I walked over, because I'd decided somewhere in the previous few weeks that I was no longer going to drop whatever I was doing the moment Grant Hollis wanted my attention. You can't be here, I said, keeping my voice low, aware of Denise a few feet away pretending not to listen. I just wanted to talk. 5 minutes. You had 5 minutes at my apartment in July. You used them to tell me about another woman. I glanced at the front desk attendant, a college kid named Theo, who was already reaching for his phone, unsure whether this required intervention. I'm working, Grant. This isn't the place, and there isn't going to be another place either. He left without arguing, which was almost more unsettling than if he'd pushed back. I found out later through Callie that he'd been telling their mother he was trying to make amends that summer, a phrase that apparently made Eleanor proud of him for about a week before Walter pointed out that amends generally don't involve showing up uninvited to someone's workplace. Denise, the client I'd been training when Grant walked in, asked me afterward if I was okay, and I told her honestly that I was, that it had simply been the first time in months I'd watched an old habit try to reassert itself and felt nothing underneath it but mild irritation at the interruption. She said that sounded like progress. I think she was right. The financial mess took longer to untangle than the emotional one. The country club's coordinator called Grant 3 times that week about the outstanding balance, $18,000 for the venue, only 40% refundable per the contract, since the cancellation happened same day. The caterer, a company called Thistle and Oak, had already prepped for 140 plates and refused to refund the $6,400 deposit at all, citing the contract's 48-hour cancellation clause. The florist kept the full $900. The photographer, who'd already driven up from Cincinnati and unpacked half his equipment before the whole thing fell apart, invoiced Grant and Bryn jointly for a partial day rate of $1,100. And from what Callie told me later, the two of them spent the better part of a month arguing over who legally owed what, since neither of them wanted to be the one who paid for a wedding that never happened to a person they no longer intended to marry. None of that was my problem anymore, except that Callie, in a fit of something between guilt and fury, marched into a family dinner 3 weeks later and forced Grant in front of both parents to finally send me the $1,200 he'd kept from our old security deposit. You're going to sit there and let him keep pretending he's the injured party in every version of this story, she told me she'd said to the table, while he still owes his ex-girlfriend money from an apartment he stopped paying for 8 months ago. He did it by bank transfer that same night. No note, no apology attached. I used it to buy a used weight rack for my apartment. It felt like a fitting use for the money. Bryn resurfaced in late July, 10 days after the wedding, with a long post on social media about betrayal and healing, and finding herself again, artfully worded, tagged with hashtags about growth. She wrote about recently discovering my partner wasn't who I thought he was. A sentence so carefully constructed it took me a second read to realize it was true in the most technical sense possible, while managing to erase everything she'd actually done. She never mentioned Milo's wife by name. She never mentioned the timeline, the March baby shower, the months of quietly keeping her exits open while everyone else built a wedding around her. The post got hundreds of comments, mostly sympathetic pathetic, mostly from people who had no idea what I knew. I didn't comment. I didn't need to. Priya texted me a screenshot with 3 words. I can't even. I sent back a single laughing emoji and put my phone down. I heard, through the same slow network of mutual friends that had carried every other piece of this story to me, that Milo and Bryn didn't last. Whatever they'd been to each other in secret didn't survive being dragged into daylight. Priya heard from someone who still followed Bryn online that the two of them saw each other for barely 6 more weeks before it fell apart quietly, without any of the drama that had ended it with Grant. Sasha filed for divorce in September. Bryn, from what I understand, moved to Columbus by early winter, ostensibly for a job, though I suspect the job was mostly an excuse to stop running into people who already knew the ending of her own story better than she wanted them to. A month after the wedding that wasn't, a woman I'd never met messaged me directly, Sasha Reyes. I almost didn't open it, assuming it was spam, but something made me tap through. "I'm sorry to reach out like this," she wrote. "I heard from a mutual acquaintance that you'd also been hurt by these 2 people, in a different way, a while back. I just wanted to say I'm sorry you went through it, and that finding out the truth, even when it's ugly, is still better than living inside someone else's lie. I hope you're doing okay." I wrote back and thanked her, told her I hoped the same for her, and we exchanged maybe 4 more messages after that, careful and kind. 2 strangers briefly comparing notes on the same 2 people from opposite ends of the timeline. We haven't spoken since, but I think about her sometimes, and I hope wherever she landed, it was somewhere better than where Milo left her. She texted me directly once more in August. "I keep thinking about you lately. I miss what we had before all this. 12 years has to mean something, right?" I looked at that message for a long time before I answered it, because some part of me, the part that still remembered a phone charger and a laugh that filled a hallway, wanted it to mean something too. Then I thought about the throw pillow behind her head, and the 4 months of silence about Milo, and the way she'd let me find out through Eleanor instead of ever telling me herself, and I typed back, "It meant something. That's exactly why I'm not interested in pretending the last 2 years didn't happen. I hope you figure yourself out." I blocked her number after I hit send, not out of anger, out of something closer to grief, the kind you feel when you finally bury something you'd been keeping alive out of habit, rather than hope. I want to be honest about that grief, because it would be dishonest to tell this story as though I only felt vindicated. There was a night in September, nearly 10 months after I first found Grant and Bryn together, when I sat on my apartment floor with an old shoebox of photographs I'd never fully unpacked from the move. Bryn and me at 19, matching friendship bracelets we'd bought from a street vendor in Columbus, both of us grinning like we already knew we'd be friends forever. The 2 of us at 24, asleep on a bus somewhere outside Nashville, heads knocked together, a trip we'd taken with $60 between us and no real plan. Grant and me at a lake house in 2016, before any of it, when he used to look at me like I was the only person in the room worth looking at, before that look quietly curdled into something closer to inventory. There was a folded piece of paper near the bottom of the box, one I'd forgotten entirely. A note Bryn had written me in 2015, the year after we graduated, tucked into a care package she'd mailed when I was going through a rough stretch at my first job. "Whatever happens to either of us," it said in her round, looping handwriting, "you're my person. That's not going to change." I sat with that note in my hands for a long time. I thought about how easy it is to mean something completely when you write it, and how little that guarantees about who you'll still be a decade later. I cried for almost an hour, not because I wanted either of them back, but because I was allowed to miss the people I thought they were, even while being glad I'd never see the people they actually turned out to be again. Grief, I've learned, doesn't always attach itself cleanly to the person in front of you. Sometimes it's for a version of them that only ever existed in the specific light of a particular year, gone the moment that light changed. I didn't throw the photographs away. I put the note back where I'd found it, put the lid back on the box, and set it on the top shelf of my closet, where it still sits. It's been a little over a year now since that morning Eleanor called me. My life looks almost nothing like it did then. And also, in the ways that matter most, it looks exactly like what I always wanted it to. I work part-time at Marcus Webb's gym now, the same trainer who handed me a plan and never once asked why I needed one. I got certified myself last spring, and I've started building a small client list of my own, mostly women who've spent years hearing some version of the sentence I used to hear, "You have such a pretty face," and are ready to stop waiting for the rest of that sentence to be kind. My first client, a woman named Farida, told me in our second session that she'd spent 11 years married to a man who used to comment on her plate at every family dinner without ever once raising his voice. I recognized the shape of that story before she finished telling it. I'm not trying to save anyone. I just know what it's like to finally decide your own needs aren't negotiable, and I like being in the room when someone else figures that out too. Thanksgiving that year was its own small referendum. Callie invited me to hers instead of her parents. The first time in a decade I hadn't spent the holiday somewhere connected to Grant, and I said yes before I'd even fully processed what it meant. It was a smaller gathering. Callie, her boyfriend Priya, a couple of Callie's co-workers, no Eleanor, no Walter, no Grant. Callie made a turkey that came out slightly dry and a stuffing that didn't, and at one point, halfway through the meal, she raised her glass and said, without much ceremony, "To the people who actually show up for each other. There's fewer of us than I used to think, but I like this table a lot better." Priya clinked her glass against mine under the table, a small private gesture, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for over a year. I heard secondhand that Eleanor and Walter's Thanksgiving Thanksgiving that same day was quieter than usual, just the two of them and Grant, who'd apparently spent most of the meal on his phone, texting someone Eleanor didn't recognize. Callie told me about it a few days later with an expression that was equal parts sad and unsurprised. I think Mom's finally starting to see the pattern, she said. It just took losing basically everyone else at the table to do it. I moved apartments again in the spring, a one-bedroom on the other side of Ridgemont with better light and no view of a parking structure. I painted the bedroom myself this time, a deep green called Juniper Hollow, no help from anyone. 4 coats, exactly the color I wanted, and nobody else's opinion folded into the choice. There's a framed photo on my dresser now from a 5-kilometer race I ran in April, my first, finished in 38 minutes, a time that means nothing to anyone but me and means everything to me. Marcus took the photo without me noticing, right at the finish line. My face caught somewhere between exhaustion and something close to joy. I didn't know it existed until he printed it and handed it to me a week later, saying only, "Thought you should have proof of this one." I framed it that same night. Callie and I have dinner most Sundays now. Priya too sometimes. Eleanor and I speak occasionally, careful and a little formal, the way you talk to someone you're rebuilding something with slowly, brick by brick, neither of us sure yet how tall it's allowed to get. She sent me a birthday card in the spring, the first one in 2 years, with a short handwritten note that just said, "I hope this year is entirely your own. I keep it in a drawer, not the shoebox." Different kind of thing. I haven't spoken to Grant since that night at my door. I haven't spoken to Bryn since August. I don't imagine I will again, and for the first time in a year, that fact doesn't feel like a wound. It just feels like a settled thing, the way a house settles after enough seasons, quiet and no longer shifting underfoot. I think about that word sometimes. Match. Grant used it like an insult, like a verdict on a body he'd decided wasn't worth keeping. Eleanor used it like a prize, like something I'd finally earned the right to claim, 7 months before she'd beg me at a ruined wedding to marry her son within the hour. I've come to understand it differently than either of them meant it. I don't match anyone's life anymore, and I'm not trying to. I built my own slowly out of 5:45 alarms and a therapist's one good question and a shoebox I couldn't quite throw away. Some mornings that feels like winning. Other mornings it just feels like what was left after everything else burned down, and I'm still standing in the ashes deciding what's worth rebuilding. I don't know if Grant ever understood what he actually did that night in November, sitting me down with a speech he'd clearly rehearsed. He thought he was ending something. Mostly he was just handing me back to myself, 8 months before he even knew what that would cost him. I don't say that with any satisfaction left in it anymore. It's just the plainest way I know to tell the truth about what happened. Some people will hear this story and want it to end with Grant alone in some cold apartment, or Bryn friendless in a city where nobody remembers her name, and I understand the appeal of that ending. It isn't the one I got, and I'm not sure it's the one I'd choose even if it had been offered. What I got instead was smaller and stranger, and in its own way, more useful. I got my name back. I got to decide finally what I was willing to carry for other people and what I was allowed to set down. Both of those things are true at once, the winning and the ashes. I've stopped needing them not to be.